there seems to be this line of thinking that when you're exercising, that you're only expending and utilizing one type of fuel source, whether it be carbohydrates, triglycerides, fat, or even amino acids and protein. It's like, oh, I'm just using those right now. I'm just using those right now. But it's not that simple. There's more to it. The fact of the matter is we use all of them. We use all of our substrates for all activities at all times. That's the reality of it. And so we're going to dig into a little bit of the substrate requirements during exercise, the fuel contributions during exercise. And you can see from this really nice VO2 percentage max bar graph that as VO2 max increases, the relative amount of muscle glycogen and plasma glucose floating around in the bloodstream increases, okay? VO2 max is a percentage of one's maximal oxygen uptake. So the higher intensity the activity, thinking short duration, high intensity activities that won't really last longer than a couple of minutes. As an example, for 800 meter sprint, you could do, a weight training set. You could be doing an AMRAP, deadlift or squat or bench press, which could last you, 45 to 90 seconds to 2 minutes, okay? Predominantly here using predominantly using glucose and glycogen, okay? Whereas now we go down on that percentage of VO2 max, we begin to shift. We begin to do a shift. About 65% is a bit of a hybrid between fatty acids and glycogen/glucose. And then once we get to 25% of VO2 max, and just for context, 25% of VO2 max is walking pace. So what I'm doing now, just talking, gesticulating, we could be probably maybe at 10 to 15% VO2 max. Predominantly free fatty acids floating around in the bloodstream and muscle triglycerides. So pretty important to understand now, and we're still burning and expending some glycogen and glucose, but the ratio has changed. Okay, so now this has some considerations for, okay, what type of activity will be stimulating or liberating what type of fuel sources, because we know, we scroll up here, very like energy system 101, that these different energy systems that we have, ATP, our anaerobic energy systems, the ones that don't use oxygen, that just rely on phosphocreatine stores to fuel the mitochondria for energy, they're really only lasting, 5 to 10 seconds, and then we start ramping up with slowly with more oxygen, and aerobic oxidation begins to take place. We begin to use more oxygen to fuel energy metabolism. But this now relies on different energy substrates. Anaerobic glycolysis, that under 30 seconds high intensity stuff, even under a minute or 2 minutes, stored glycogen and glucose. Whereas we increase that duration, lower that intensity, now we're primarily using triglycerides, which is the primary form of fat, and the free fatty acids just floating around in our circulation, okay? And then we see, the key point here is increased exercise intensity increases carbohydrate use as a fuel source. And then we come down here, and then we see that the change in substrate used over a 4-hour bout, talking marathons, for example, we begin to see that plasma fatty acids and begins to take a predominant substrate as the duration goes on. Blood glucose also begins to increase as well, likely because more muscle glycogen is being liberated and from the liver as well, and it's releasing this into the bloodstream. That's my theory on why potentially we're seeing more blood glucose from there. Also because we potentially may be breaking down, maybe some gluconeogenesis may be occurring, which may be then increasing the circulation serum stores of glucose. But regardless of the mechanism behind it, plasma fatty acids go up, blood glucose goes up, muscle glycogen goes down. Key point here, increased exercise duration, increased use of serum fuel sources as muscle stores become depleted. So, and this is obviously, we're not taking into account intra-exercise a refueling. If you take a carbohydrate gel, whatever, you're going to attenuate these losses, and you're actually going to predominantly still use a relatively higher amount of muscle or probably serum glucose, because it won't have time to be absorbed into the muscle, to my recollection. So that will influence, the relative use of substrates. And lastly, we see once again some more the hepatic liver glucose output during exercise at varying intensities. In brackets, you can see the relative percentage at different time periods, and that during the first 30 minutes, like 85% of this glucose output is occurring within that first 30-40 minutes, and it steeply goes down after that point as more and more fatty acids are liberated and the body relies on other fuel stores endogenously. Come over here. I've always wanted to do a post on this because I'm like, man, people don't think about this. People don't think, it's like all or nothing. It's like, I'm using glucose, I'm using fatty acids. No, motherfucker, you're using them all the time. It's just different ratios, just like energy systems. It's not one on, one off. You're using all three energy systems, ATP, anaerobic glycolysis, and aerobic system. It's just a relative proportion that is changing, which is the beautiful thing. We're adaptive, beautiful little hominids, aren't we? I think so. And so this is like physiology 101. This is stuff I've done years ago, but I've always wanted to talk about. Now I'm going to do it. Why not? So, yep, that same graph we just saw there. Why does the contribution of plasma fuels decrease and muscle fuels decrease? Well, as plasma fuels, that should say increase. Excuse me. As exercise continues, we get a gradual depletion of muscle glycogen. Because we're getting this depletion of muscle glycogen, we need to maintain blood glucose concentrations. Otherwise, the muscle will then keep drawing glucose from the bloodstream or running out of glycogen in the muscle. We have to get some glucose from somewhere, and we're getting it from the bloodstream. And if we keep pulling it from the bloodstream, blood glucose will decrease. So there are efforts made by the body to maintain blood glucose. So there's an increase in hepatic liver glucose output to maintain blood glucose. As we saw here, there's an increase in hepatic liver glucose output, particularly in the beginning, but this decreases over time. And there's also an increase in gluconeogenesis, like I talked about earlier. And the sources of that can be lactate, not just amino acids, but the glycerol backbone of fatty acids can be used. Lactate is used as a fuel source, I think in the citric acid cycle, if I recall correctly. And so, little bit of context around fuel contributions during exercise. It's not all or none. It's not on-off switches. It's we're going to use them all. And now you should know, okay, if you want to predominantly use a certain fuel source, let's understand the type of activity and the relative percentage of VO2 max one should maybe be working at to predominantly use that fuel source. Potentially why LISS, low intensity steady state cardio, is used a hell of a lot for our bodybuilders who are cutting. And it's not just to manage central fatigue and manage systemic fatigue. Maybe it's also because we understand a little bit about physiology and we know we can predominantly create a higher utilization and liberation of these free fatty acids, because we don't want those when we're trying to get ripped, do we? No, we don't, ladies and gentlemen. That's it. Hope that was helpful.